I'm Devin Stone, a practicing lawyer and adjunct law professor, and host of the Legal Eagle Law Channel, and I'm here to answer your questions from Twitter. This is Law Support. From @Granule, where is the line between hate speech and free speech? Actually, there is no line. A lot of countries take different philosophies when it comes to hate speech, but in the United States, hate speech has the same kind of First Amendment protections as most speech. Now, there are some quasi-exceptions to that. When it comes to certain crimes, you can get an enhancement if it was done for a racially or hate-related reason, but for the most part, just when we're talking about free speech, hate speech is free speech, and you can love it or hate it. Reasonable minds will differ on that one. From Airbag Moments, serious question for lawyers. If I threaten my judge with death in the courtroom, isn't he/she now prejudiced against me and must be replaced? So this is a great example of the difference between prejudice and undue prejudice. Courts are designed to prevent things that cause undue prejudice in the courtroom. We don't want an outside influence unfairly prejudicing the judge, the jury, or anyone else. But what happens inside the courtroom is pretty much fair game. That might be prejudicial, but that's not unfair or undue prejudice. So don't go around threatening the judge with death. Whatever happens in court can and will be used against you. From Blue Road Earth, why was OJ found not guilty in criminal court but liable in civil court? This question was phrased very well because they show the difference between liability and criminal liability, or guilt in this context. Now, the standard in a criminal case is beyond a reasonable doubt. So if someone is found not guilty, it doesn't mean that they didn't commit a crime, it just means that the prosecution didn't meet their burden. Now, in the civil context, you're trying to make the victims whole for the damages that you have caused them. And that's exactly what the estates of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman did with O.J. Simpson. Even though the state was not successful in criminally prosecuting O.J. Simpson, they were successful in filing a civil suit where the standard is only a preponderance of the evidence, basically more likely than not. From @Marzobound, when is a grand jury used over a regular jury if it's just ordinary people either way? So the jury that actually decides whether someone is guilty or not is called a petty jury, P-E-T-I-T. It's Latin, don't ask. A grand jury, on the other hand, is actually a much lower bar. A grand jury is used by prosecutors to decide whether to indict someone. And the reason that people often say a grand jury could indict a ham sandwich is because it's completely one-sided. It's really just a basic check to decide whether the case can go forward. It doesn't actually decide whether someone's guilty or not. B. Brooks 4791 asks, why not testify if you're innocent? Why plead the fifth if you're innocent? This applies to anyone. It does actually apply to anyone. Just because you are invoking the Fifth Amendment, which is the protection against self-incrimination and being forced to testify against yourself, that doesn't mean that you committed any crimes. Maybe you don't want to testify because that might open you up to unrelated crimes. You might be innocent of the thing you're accused of, but might be guilty of a whole bunch of other things. Or you might be completely innocent of everything and just not want to testify. You might be really bad on the stand. So be glad that if you're ever accused of a crime, you aren't going to be forced to testify against yourself. You have the option not to testify. From Merc the Mods, how do DraftKings and FanDuel get around anti-gambling laws? So for a long time, FanDuel and DraftKings were completely illegal across the entire US, except for fantasy-related sports betting. Those are generally considered games of skill. However, when it comes to general betting on a sports book, that was considered gambling and was illegal until 2018. When the Supreme Court struck that law down, it was left up to the states. And now there have been a lot of states that have said we are totally fine with people gambling in our states. We would really like the tax revenue, and as a result, it's now legal to use online websites like FanDuel and DraftKings. From I Should 12, how much of a difference is there between a guilty plea versus no contest? So if you are accused of a criminal violation, you have a couple options if you don't want to go to trial. You could just enter a plea of guilty, but sometimes you have the option to plead no contest. Effectively, in the criminal context, you're treated exactly the same as if you had pled guilty. If your crime harmed someone and they then sued you after you pled guilty, well, you would be civilly liable for whatever damages you caused, almost automatically, because the standard in a criminal case is so much higher than a civil case. But if you plead no contest, they have to prove that you are liable in the civil context. Generally speaking, if the option is available, a smart defendant will plead no contest rather than guilty. From Red Rollins 1, you know why there are so many frivolous lawsuits in America? So I think that people vastly overestimate how many frivolous lawsuits there are. It's a lot of selection bias going on. You're not going to hear about a breach of contract case that involves a vendor who got 10,000 industrial widgets when he ordered 12,000 industrial widgets, and some of them were non-conforming. You're not going to hear about that because it's super boring. But you are going to hear about the most ridiculous cases that are out there, the most frivolous cases, because those are the ones that are interesting and are going to make news. From Better Tech, and lo and behold, UMG sues for fake Drake and The Weeknd song generated by AI. But whom can it sue apart from the company that made the AI? Artists do often have rights to their likeness and sometimes even the rights to how they sound. But we are entering a brave new world where the law is going to come down in terms of what constitutes infringement or not. It's going to be an interesting outcome because it's not at all obvious where that's going to come down. C. Dashel asks, can you actually avoid being sued by simply avoiding being served papers? That would be a ridiculous loophole. I agree, that would be ridiculous, and generally speaking, that's not the case. What happens is, if you avoid service for long enough, you get to do what's called substitution of service, where instead of physically handing the service papers to someone, you just put it into a newspaper, and then you might not even know that the proceedings have started. And believe me, you do not want to have a lawsuit against you and not participate. What happens is a default judgment where you just lose and you didn't get a chance to defend yourself. Don't play games, accept service, and just hire a lawyer. It's the better way to do it. From Extra Spicy Tums, why are there so many accident lawyer billboards in LA? Can someone enlighten me here? Because once I started noticing them, I can't stop now. There was actually a Supreme Court case in the 1970s that allowed lawyers to advertise on billboards. Before that, the law said they couldn't. And look, if you are going to advertise related to car accidents, putting up a billboard is probably the best way to do it. Query whether you are creating more accidents, but that's just what we call a virtuous cycle. You're creating your own market, so that sounds great. From @QuasiAsher, wait, how is Jury Duty, the TV show, remotely legal? Waivers, lots and lots of waivers. From @Yulet.Kai, spare tips to make studying law less boring, please. I would say this, behind every single case is a story. And unless you are studying civil procedure, you can basically ignore the procedure of a case and just focus on the story of what happened. Whether you're talking about a breach of contract or a horrible accident, there's probably something really interesting going on in the background, and it makes it a lot easier to remember, and it makes it more interesting to study as well. From @HBNW7, why does the law have to be complicated and expensive? ? It's because lawyers hate you and they want to make an example of you. You in particular. Lawyers get a lot of flack. Our job is to be careful. And the thing is, reality is really complicated. There's a lot of stuff that can go wrong. If you're writing a contract or you're writing a law, you have to make sure that you cover all of the different edge cases. And not only that, language is really complicated, especially the English language. So there's a million different cases about what constitutes a chicken. What happens if a boat has the same name as another boat? What happens if you write a law and you forget a comma? All of those things have absolutely happened. Judges, juries, and lawyers have to try and figure out what to do when something is ambiguous, and the world is ambiguous all the time. From Spring Tamij, how do lawyers ethically defend their client when there is, say, video evidence of them trying to run over a person twice? Everyone is entitled to a good defense, and there are a million different reasons and ways that a lawyer might defend even a guilty person, even if they think that person is guilty. Maybe the prosecutor is trying to convict someone and get a sentence that's way, way too high. You don't want someone who's accused of petty burglary to face the death penalty. And so, there are a lot of different degrees that you can use to defend someone, regardless of whether they're guilty or not. And everyone deserves a reasonable defense. Shubgadam52. Will AI replace lawyers? You probably don't want an AI lawyer anytime soon. A lawyer is not just simply a machine that knows what the law is. A lawyer is a person with, theoretically, years of expertise that can help you strategically to achieve your goals. And that's not something that AI is well positioned to replace anytime soon. What I suspect is going to happen is that AI is going to make a lot of the drudgery of practicing practicing law way easier, and it will allow lawyers to focus on the really value-add stuff and allow them to think strategically and to better represent their clients in the future. So I welcome our AI overlords. From Dean Hair Photo, when does attorney-client privilege end and that the lawyer is a co-conspirator begin? Well, there is a law on point, and that is called the crime-fraud exception. If a lawyer helps a client engage in fraud, then the attorney-client privilege is pierced. And theoretically, if the lawyer really is engaging in criminality, then they can become a co-conspirator. From Butterfly Babes 5, why is perjury not enforced? So many are saying nothing will happen to #Amber Heard for lying under oath. Then what's the point of taking the oath? So first of all, perjury is actually enforced. Perjury being lying under oath. That being said, it's really hard to convict someone of perjury. Just because you lost a civil case, that doesn't mean that you engaged in lying. And in fact, even in the Amber Heard Johnny Depp context, where there was a countersuit and Johnny Depp won, that doesn't necessarily mean that anyone on the other side of that was necessarily lying. And generally speaking, prosecutors have better things to prosecute than a marginal case of potential perjury. From Molly Haynes, how do lawyers just know the law? Like, I had to learn the nitty-gritty of one law and it drove me nuts. You're telling me law students just learn every law and then some international law? Lawyers rarely know every law. The body of American law that's out there is it's too huge, and it's not possible for any one person to know. What tends to happen is you know the law that you use in practice all the time. Say a prayer for all the lawyers out there, because if you come to us with a novel question, we're probably not gonna know the law off the top of our head, and we're gonna have to research it, and frankly, you want it that way. From Peter Unwin, when a driverless car is involved in an accident, who should be responsible? When a driverless car gets into an accident, there are two potential avenues of liability. One is negligence, and the other is product liability. When it comes to product liability, basically, if you put a product into the stream of commerce, you're what's called strictly liable for any damages that product causes. A manufacturer could also be liable based on a negligence theory, that there was some industry norm they should have followed and they didn't. But there are a million other people that might also be liable under a negligence theory. Maybe there was another driver who was responsible. It's gonna be a case-by-case basis, but those are gonna be the leading theories under which someone's going to be liable. From Nancy Gerlach 1, how does the Supreme Court choose to hear a case? That is a fascinating process. The short answer there is that of the 9 justices, 4 of them have to agree to take up a case. You cannot appeal to the Supreme Court as a matter of right. The Supreme Court has to issue what's called a writ of certiorari. In other words, they only decide what cases they hear. Now, on what basis do the Supreme Court justices decide? Often if there's a conflict between the states, if there's a matter of supreme national importance, like we saw in Bush versus Gore or Roe versus Wade, sometimes they'll take on a case just because they want to interpret a law or statute the way that they want to interpret it. From Leslie W. String of Numbers, can there even be a real crime in the metaverse if it does not translate into a real crime in the physical universe? Well, there's all kinds of crimes in the real world that do not involve a physical act. There's the civil action of defamation, and that can happen in the real world or in the metaverse. If you meet the elements of a crime in the metaverse, I would suspect that crime is going to be prosecuted in the same way that it would be prosecuted in real life too. From Friend of Gandalf, why is there a statute of limitations for crimes? The reason a statute of limitations exists is because after a whole lot of time has passed, often it can be really hard to find evidence. It might be impossible to find witnesses. So it's a balancing act. We want to punish the guilty, but we don't want to punish the innocent. So we have a statute of limitations to make sure that it's fair for a defendant to be able to defend themselves in a case where a lot of time has passed and otherwise they wouldn't be able to defend themselves. From Stove Allergy, when lawyers say something in court and object to it, and the judge tells the jury to disregard that, do they think it's deleted from their brains? No, definitely not. Lawyers are fully cognizant of the fact that things that happen in court, even when you get a limiting instruction from the judge, it's impossible for anyone to literally forget what has happened. That being said, a judge knows when you're screwing around, and if the judge thinks that you are intentionally violating the decorum of the court, the judge will use something called contempt. And sometimes lawyers go to jail over things that they did in a courtroom. Chloe Walker asks, it's like appeal until you get the answer you like. Is that justice? How many appeals do you get? So generally speaking, you only get one appeal. Now, theoretically, there are different courts of appeal, so you might theoretically get one more shot at the apple, but courts of appeal that are above the Intermediate Court of Appeal are like the Supreme Court, and they only take the cases that they want. So it's very rare to go past one appeal. All right, that's all of our questions. I hope you learned something today, and until next time, I'll see you in court.